Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving deep into perhaps the most famous existential riddle of all time. It's a question that really moves far beyond simple poultry husbandry, doesn't it? It gets right into fundamental issues of causation, evolutionary identity, and logical precedence. Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
It really is a perfect puzzle for illustrating that tension between, well, philosophy and biological science. It's definitely not just some simple loop of causality. It feels like it hinges entirely on how you choose to define your terms. Are we prioritizing the species identity, that specific moment Gallus domesticus sort of solidified its form, or are we prioritizing the continuous fundamental evolutionary mechanism of reproduction itself?
Exactly. And I maintain that this is primarily a debate of categories and, well, definitions. When we ask about the chicken and the chicken egg, we are implicitly asking about identity, aren't we? The fixed, defined species. It just seems it must logically precede the identification of its own product. So I'll be arguing that the chicken anchors this lineage, and therefore it must come first.
Mm-hmm. And I'm coming at it from, well, a more scientific perspective, I suppose, rooted in deep time and genetic reality. Evolutionary biology, as I see it, dictates that the egg, as the necessary vessel for that final, definitive genetic transformation, it just has to precede the creature it contains. And, let's be honest, eggs existed long, long before chickens ever walked the earth. So for me, the egg came first.
Right. So my core position really rests on semantic precision. We have to be clear. We are not just discussing fertilized ovums in general, which, yes, okay, they date back millions of years. We are talking specifically about the chicken egg. Now, by definition, for an egg to earn that specific descriptor, it has to be the product of a chicken, right? Or at the very least be defined by the species it contains, which only really matters once the species itself is identified. This feels like a point of logical necessity. We could even draw parallels to philosophical concepts like Aquinas' first cause or maybe Aristotle's prime mover. Even if we accept that the process of evolution is gradual, and of course it is, we still need an intellectual anchor, a point of origin to categorize a new line. And that anchor, I argue, is the first individual creature that possessed all the defining characteristics of a chicken, irrespective of which creature actually laid its shell. That first true chicken then establishes the identity for every single chicken egg that follows.
Okay, I understand the need for neat, categorical boundaries, I really do. But those boundaries, well, they feel inherently arbitrary from an evolutionary standpoint, don't they? The biological truth is just it's messy, it's continuous. We know the reproductive mechanism of laying amniotic eggs is ancient. It precedes birds by hundreds of millions of years. But even if we focus strictly on that transition, from proto-chicken to chicken, the genetic evidence seems pretty incontrovertible. The defining genetic mutation, or maybe the accumulation of shifts, whatever it was, that ultimately pushed the organism over that species threshold, well, it occurred at the level of the gametes, the sperm and egg, meaning the transformation physically happened inside the vessel laid by the parent. And that parent, by definition, was the last proto-chicken. So the new species, the first true chicken, was physically contained within that egg before it ever hatched. The egg is the chemical and genetic forge, if you like. The chicken is just the resulting product.
It's a compelling argument based on chronological accumulation, I'll grant you that. But let's press on this issue of categories. You seem to continually conflate the universal, ancient process, the egg in general, with the very specific categorical identity of the chicken egg. If we strip away that semantic requirement, then the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg, it just becomes meaningless, doesn't it? But if we accept that species identity matters, and humanity, through classification, has placed a pretty definitive boundary around Gallus domesticus, then that recognition, that form, it must logically precede the definition of its product. If the category doesn't exist yet, how can the product possibly be named or defined?
But that reliance on a fixed category, though, it runs straight into the reality of gradual change. I see the difficulty your position faces trying to map these sort of neat intellectual categories onto biological flux. You're sort of positing a moment where the form of chicken just magically appears. Yet evolution simply doesn't work that way. It is continuous. And this is exactly where we run into that classic conceptual challenge, like the Ship of Theseus paradox. If you have a ship and you gradually replace every single plank, at what specific instantaneous point does it stop being the old ship and become a new one?
That is a fascinating philosophical tool, sure. But how does the Ship of Theseus truly apply here? Is it a perfect analogy?
I think it applies precisely because there isn't an external, clean moment of creation. The species line is crossed by the accumulation of these, genetic planks. When the final necessary genetic change, the one that differentiates the chicken from its ancestor, occurs, it happens internally. It happens at the moment of conception, inside the egg. The egg therefore contains the new ship before the ship ever sails, so to speak. So to prioritize the category, the chicken feels like imposing a static, human-defined break onto what is fundamentally a continuous dynamic process. The gradual biological reality, for me, undermines this notion of a neat, pre-existing chicken form that suddenly laid the first true egg. Okay, let's maybe shift focus slightly to temporal priority, which is often the intuitive answer people seem to look for. When we ask which came first, we are at a basic level asking about time. And temporally, the egg structure existed hundreds of millions of years ago. It was used by creatures as disparate as early fish, reptiles, dinosaurs. The chicken, on the other hand, is a relatively recent evolutionary newcomer, maybe only solidifying its modern form within the last, 8,000 years or so, largely through domestication. So, on the cosmic timeline, the egg is just this ancient fundamental innovation.
I'm still not quite convinced by that line of reasoning, mainly because temporal priority feels, almost irrelevant to the question of identity in this specific context. If we just accept the premise that eggs generally predate chickens, then the debate is over before it begins, right? And the riddle is trivialized. The only way the question retains its philosophical weight, its punch, is if we anchor it specifically to the species. Logically, the concept of a chicken egg, that specific object we are actually debating, depends entirely on the prior existence of the species chicken. Without that fixed identity, the object is just, a bird egg or a reptile egg or maybe a proto-chicken egg. You see the difference? It's temporal age versus logical necessity. And I would argue that essence, the definitional necessity, must define the process here, which is fundamentally setting the rules, the process of reproduction or the essence of the creature.
It's a neat philosophical package, I'll admit, but how does it survive contact with the actual biological reality of causation? Let's really get down to the genetics for a second. You concede that the definitive traits were established at the DNA level inside the egg. Okay. Now, furthermore, consider the complex role of the egg beyond just, containing the zygote. We look at fields like epigenetics, the study of these heritable changes in gene expression that happen without altering the underlying DNA sequence itself. These epigenetic modifications, they're often influenced by the environment inside the egg and are finalized during early development. So the egg is more than just a shell.
But wait, those epigenetic factors, while sure they're crucial for trait expression, aren't they often dictated by the mother's physiology and diet? Meaning, the proto-chicken or chicken that produced the egg, doesn't that trace the causation right back to the parent organism again? I feel like you're treating the egg as some kind of independent creative entity rather than, perhaps more accurately, merely the vessel for the parent's genetic material and, yes, some environmental influence derived from that parent. The source of the identity, the blueprint, and the initial conditions, they still originate with the creature that constructed and laid the egg.
But that only reinforces the dilemma, doesn't it? Because if the mother was the last proto-chicken, she could not possibly transmit the chicken species identity, only the proto-chicken identity she possessed. The first chicken DNA was synthesized in that vessel, using her components maybe, but resulting in something new. Therefore, the egg is the critical stage. It's the active environment where the new species is actually born, genetically and physiologically.
Okay, let me try a different tack. Let me counter with, say, the technology analogy. Imagine we have the first true computer. Now the computer needs hardware, right? The physical machine, let's call that the chicken. and it needs software, the code, the DNA, the gametes. You seem to be arguing that the program, the code for the first chicken, came first because it was written, so to speak, inside the shell. But I would argue that the identified functional physical machine, the hardware that carries the species marker and can reproduce in kind, that is the anchor point of origin. Without the functional hardware, the code is just potential. It's the realized identity that truly matters.
The hardware is a consequence of the code. In our analogy, the proto-chicken parent was running the old operating system. The process of laying and incubating the egg allowed for the new, definitive operating system, the chicken DNA, to execute and then manifest. The egg is the transition chamber. Therefore, the egg, containing the new code, necessarily precedes the machine defined by that code. I mean, think about it. Every single chicken that has ever existed had to go through that phase of being contained, defined, and fundamentally altered within an egg. There's no way around that biological step.
And yet, every single egg that is properly defined as a chicken egg had to be conceived by something that, even if not a fully realized chicken itself, was the immediate precursor whose defining characteristic was precisely the ability to produce that specific lineage. The potential was already there in the parent line.
And in that moment of transition, the proto-chicken produced the proto-chicken egg, which contained the first chicken. That temporal sequence, combined with the genetic leap happening inside, it seems to me firmly establishes the egg's priority.
Conclusion. Well, our discussion, I think, continually brings us back to this inherent tension between human classification, our need for neat boxes, and the messiness of biological reality. My argument remains anchored in philosophical identity and perhaps the necessity of categorical distinctions. To rationally speak of a chicken egg, the category of chicken must logically exist first. The chicken, as the stable, defined species, it remains the intellectual anchor point, establishing the parameters of its own lineage, regardless of how long the underlying reproductive mechanism has existed.
And my position remains grounded firmly in the facts of evolution and genetic causation. The scientific reality, as I see it, is that change happens in the reproductive mechanism. The defining species-level mutation occurred within the egg, which was laid by an ancestor who was, by definition, not yet a chicken. So for me, the egg is the older, the more fundamental, and crucially, the causally essential precursor to the existence of the modern species we call the chicken.
It really does act as a profound reflection, this debate, on how we understand causality and origins. It asks us whether we privilege the essence, the intellectual classification, or the process, the relentless flow of biological change.
Indeed. And the source material really does show a robust and credible argument for both sides here. Whether you prioritize the elegant logic of fixed categories or the continuous, undeniable process of biological flux, there's definitely a deep truth to be found. Ultimately, I suppose, it is up to the listener to weigh which form of evidence, the definitional perhaps or the mechanistic, holds the greater weight in solving this timeless riddle.